Hello and welcome to episode 156 of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty. Of course, I am your host, Rick Doherty. Maz is back on the show this week to continue our conversation about Disney's perception issues. This week, we turn our focus to Star Wars and Marvel and how Disney basically turns into a deer in headlights when faced with online criticism. Before we get started, head over to the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel and make sure that you are subscribed. We had a big burst in subscriptions towards the end of 2023, but it started to level off a little bit. Make sure to share the show with friends and on social media. There's a lot of cool stuff in the works. This past week, I had a 3-part vlog series from Epcot's International Festival of the Arts, which included the great Julia Schieser performing. She's the German language singing voice of Belle in the live-action Beauty and the Beast and Jasmine in the live-action Aladdin. We check out Heidi Blickenstaff and Gavin Lee performing in the Disney on Broadway concert series. That performance will blow your mind. They are so incredibly talented. I check out a lot of the food options for the festival, and we see the One Little Spark and Rainbow Connection light shows on Spaceship Earth. It is over an hour of art, food, and music. This festival, in my humble opinion, is everything that is great about Epcot as a park. Make sure you check it out very, very soon. Right now, let's get things started in our main conversation. Thanks for being here, Maz.
Thank you for having me.
So we are doing the second part of our conversation about Disney and its perception issues. And we talked about some things that are sort of controversial, but not the topics themselves, more how Disney has handled them and caused them to be bigger problems. We talked about things like Splash Mountain, the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, and even how Universal is able to handle some of these things with so much more ease than Disney handles them. And we're going to get to what might be the biggest area where Disney has just failed the perception war, and that is with Star Wars. Ever since acquiring the property from George Lucas, there have certainly been ups and downs. There have been times where it's looked like they were handling it very, very well. But what are your thoughts on how there has been this huge fracture in the Star Wars fan base since Disney acquired it from George Lucas?
Oh my gosh. I mean, where to start? I think that, some of it is the Star Wars fan base itself. I think with a fan base as large as that one, it is arguably one of the largest fan bases in the world. You're going to have these little different factions who think, this is the way something should be done. And, you're doing something wrong by doing this. And especially with a property that has an extended universe in other media. So like there are books. So there are books that tell the story of Luke, Han, and Leia after Return of the Jedi. And then, they've already consumed that, and that's the story in their head. So then to hear, it's being adapted in a totally different way, people are going to take issue with that. Especially when it gets adapted without having a full storyline in place when they start making it.
Okay, so there are a bunch of different ways that I want to go. And the first thing I want to address, because I think this is going to come up a number of times as we continue this conversation. Maybe we should have talked about it a little bit in the last episode. Is it even possible to steer clear of controversy in 2023, 2024? Are we just at the point where everything is so politicized, everything is so internet, social media, 24/7, opinions on everything? Terms that people use when talking about movies now that 20 years ago nobody knew, that were just for the clickiest of the clicky movie nerds. And now everybody uses them because that movie nerd 20 years ago now has a YouTube channel. Are we at a point where it's impossible to be as big as Disney, to be as big as Star Wars, and not find yourself in the middle of these conversations?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think, Star Wars is a property that from its very inception also had that double-edged sword of it being easy to make political allegories with it and to like draw certain aspects of it and say that it's a political commentary. And while that may not have been, as common, because like you said, what the information wasn't as freely shared as it is now, and the opinions weren't as freely shared, I think now you run into that issue a lot more where people see something and they draw a conclusion from it, whether right or wrong, whether intentional or not. And then they share it with people and it kind of gains this traction and gains this life. And all of a sudden people are like, oh, this is what they meant. This is this is the whole meaning of it. So I do think with something like Star Wars, you're not going to avoid it. It's impossible.
Well, it's kind of funny when you have people saying like, oh, Star Wars shouldn't be getting political. And it was like, well, did you see those movies? It reminds me of on New Year's Eve when Green Day played, I guess it was New Year's Rockin' Eve. And people just discovered that American Idiot from Green Day was a political song. And you wonder about people's media literacy sometimes. But when it comes to something like Star Wars, I think that it was this huge cultural phenomenon when it happened in the 70s. And everybody, I mean, I wasn't around yet, but I presume from what I've heard, everybody was into it. Everybody went and saw Star Wars. They went to the movies, they saw them, they loved them. Huge cultural milestone. And then half of the people, 75% of the people, moved on to the next thing. But 25% of the people stayed. And until the prequels, there was really nothing that was going to jumpstart this 25% that stayed. And they developed, there were the books, like you mentioned, and they were looking for anything. I talked in the last episode, I mentioned Mallrats. This time I'm going to talk about the Kevin Smith movie Clerks, where two clerks in a convenience store are sitting around talking about when they blew up the Death Star the second time, if there were independent contractors working on it, and if it was morally wrong to blow it up the second time. There was nowhere to do this. You didn't have the internet. So this fandom developed before the internet, and then the internet comes, then you get the prequels, and then Disney buys it. It was almost this perfect storm of expectations where for 20 years, this belonged to a very, very small segment of the fandom, and then it belonged to everybody again. And that small part of the fandom did not like it.
And I think there was also increased pressure to, after the prequels, which people hated, that's when I was a child. So I enjoy two of them. But like once the prequels came out, there was so much backlash. And then it was like, there was all this anticipation of, is it going to be piling more crap on top of prequels, or are they finally going to right the wrong and do justice to the property? And you have people along all aspects of that spectrum after seeing the sequel trilogy.
Yes, and I don't think George Lucas sells Star Wars if he didn't receive the backlash that he received for the prequels. Listen, the prequels are not perfect. They are very, very flawed. However, it was George Lucas, the guy who wrote the original three, the guy who created this universe who made the prequels, and he received such a backlash from them that I do think that led partially to him selling to Disney, because he has seen that Disney can do things the right way. And the way that now a lot of Star Wars fans look at the prequels, like I remember when they came out and they were not happy. So it is a really good point that you make, that after the prequels, I think people were looking for, please do Star Wars the way I want it to be done. And then we got The Force Awakens, which I think almost everybody liked because it was very similar to some of the original content, and it was not as controversial. There were controversial parts, and we can talk about that. But I think what you're going to address here, what you hinted at earlier, and I wanted to get back to it, is after The Force Awakens, there wasn't a plan, which led to a lot of the issues.
Yeah, it just fascinates me that Disney would again go into making this trilogy, which was always meant to be a trilogy, without having a full like arc of what they think that trilogy should look like. Even just, saying the main characters are going to start here and end here. They really were just like, we're leaving it up to the people who are doing the movies. And then they switched people after the first movie, and it became a different thing, which personally I enjoyed because it felt fresh and new. Many people didn't like that. They didn't like the direction that it went. They didn't like the changes that they saw in some of their favorite characters. And it then created backlash, which led them going back to the person who made the first movie. And you could just feel this uncertainty running through the last two movies, especially the final one, where you have these like characters almost competing with themselves for who they are. And I think that leaves a story very ungrounded, and it does make it very unsatisfying just from, a character arc perspective. And, I think there's a lot of things that the trilogy did great, and I enjoy it. I think there's a lot of ways it could be improved. And I don't know. It's just wild to me that they had this huge opportunity and they kind of like went into it half baked.
So I almost see a lot of what happened around that time with Star Wars as being very similar to how Disney handled the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. And here is how I'm going to make that comparison. So they released The Force Awakens, fine, no notes. Most people were at least happy or cautiously optimistic after they saw The Force Awakens. They either really liked what they got or they thought, okay, this could be building to something really good. And then they released The Last Jedi, which is personally, I've said this before, my favorite Star Wars movie. I love it. I love The Last Jedi. I like the way that they showed that Luke, even as much of a master as he was, still questioned himself every once in a while. I like that. Well, first of all, getting back to not having a plan, I do feel like there was nowhere that Rian Johnson could have gone with Luke Skywalker, because why was he missing this entire first movie if he wasn't trying to be missing? So he was kind of backed into that corner to make Luke the grouchy old man. But anyway, I thought it was a great movie, but the backlash was tremendous. And Disney, instead of saying, we're just going to make the last movie, listened to every little piece of criticism that showed up on the internet. And you could almost, watching The Rise of Skywalker, just copy and paste from Reddit and make that script. Like, they hated Rose Tico, so all of a sudden Rose Tico can't go on this mission with them because she has to stay back and run some sort of computer, because Disney thinking they don't like Rose Tico, so what should we do with the Asian character? Put her on a computer. That was not stereotypical at all. But anyway, Rey didn't get enough training. So what's Rey saying the first 15 minutes of the movie? I got to do more training. I got to do more training. They talk about all the training that Luke did. He was with Yoda for like a day and a half, and he beat Vader. Like, he did some handstand push-ups, and all of a sudden he can beat Darth Vader, but we need Rey getting more training. Every single thing that was a criticism on the internet, instead of just making the movie, and where this relates to Don't Say Gay, it was Josh D'Amaro, pretty Josh D'Amaro, who's attractive and is well liked by the cast members, is going to record a video and he's going to play that for the cast members. And Bob Chapek, who's already seen as the evil money man, is going to talk on the conference calls to the shareholders and say something completely different. And they're going to hedge their bets and try to win over everybody instead of just doing what they want to do, what they think is the best course of action. Honestly, even if I disagree with what they do, now, with something as important as Don't Say Gay, I would not have liked that. But with something as inconsequential as Star Wars, if they would have gone a way that I didn't like in The Rise of Skywalker, but I felt like they were doing it because they had some sort of creative vision, then I would have been like, okay, that wasn't how I would have ended it. But now when I watch it, I just am literally hearing the YouTubers complaining, and I'm hearing the online comments as I'm watching this. Like, you're writing this movie for Disney. And then, did they like it? No, they didn't like it. So it didn't even accomplish what you wanted. And Disney does this with so many things. And I think The Rise of Skywalker is the ultimate example.
It really is. And it's, like you said, there's a difference between something being not my taste and something being not well done. And unfortunately, for me personally, Rise of Skywalker falls in the latter camp. I can watch something and go, ooh, not the way I would have gone, but hey, I respect their vision. They obviously had a point to doing all this. And Rise of Skywalker, like you said, it just feels like the complete opposite of that, which, again, for a company as large as Disney to sit and try to hedge those bets and say, we're going to try to appease this, group of loud people is bonkers. Like, I don't understand why they would think that that's the route to go in the first place. But I mean, hey, we got one of my favorite lines in all of Star Wars. So we got somehow Palpatine returned, which is just
which
a line.
I don't think is as bad as people make it out to seem, because I think we're so used to everything having an explanation in movies. But if you think about how real life works, like, Palpatine's not going to tell them how he returned. So it is going to be like, somehow
Right.
Palpatine returned. But I hear what you're saying. It is a bonkers line. Right.
It's the delivery for me of just being like, oh, somehow he's back. This is what we got. We got to deal with it. It's like, felt very fourth wall.
My thing about The Rise of Skywalker, the part that really gets me, is when she has the knife that is supposed to tell her where to go and find this wave finder. And she pulls out the map from it, and the exact place where she is standing, which is not where she found the knife, just happens to be the exact place where you're supposed to have this knife. And boy, that was very convenient, I guess. But I guess you can just say everything is sort of the Force, and there are definitely some questionable decisions. And like you say, when you say there's a difference between me not liking something and it being bad. Like, I'll always say the Beatles aren't my favorite band, but they're the best band. Like, I can acknowledge that they are the best at what they do, even if they're not my favorite. There are parts of Rise of Skywalker that I love, that I think were visually stimulating. I love the interaction between Kylo Ren and Han Solo, that they didn't make Han Solo a Force ghost, that it's actually a conversation in Kylo Ren. Like, perfect. No notes on that one. They definitely got screwed a little bit with Carrie Fisher dying, and that was going to be her movie in the trilogy. So they did what they could. I'm not going to blame them for that. But some of the things were just so, they have jetpacks now. Okay, let's just make it bigger and bigger and bigger instead of making it better. So some of those things I find entertaining. When I was in the theater and I saw Billy D. Williams, I was like, yeah, more of this. But then why was he even there? There was no point to him being there, except for when I was in the theater, I said, this is pretty cool. They backed themselves into that. And you made mention of this before we started recording, and I think this is the perfect way to steer the conversation right now. They did the exact same thing with Marvel, and you can even see that with some of the most recent movies. Now, you know Marvel a lot better than I know it, so I want you to talk about this particularly.
Yeah, it's this strange phenomenon where it feels like since, we closed out the first arc with Endgame. And ever since then, it's felt almost like they've been trying to refine their footing and they haven't quite caught on yet. It's wild because, again, it's a case of trying to please everyone, but they're going about it in a different way than they are with Star Wars. With Marvel, they've decided that they're just going to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And they're producing so much content now that you can't have consistent quality across all the things you're releasing. They are pushing out so much that even for Marvel fans, it's starting to feel overwhelming. And then they're like, okay, well, people don't want to see these Marvel movies, so let's give them Marvel TV shows. And it's like, okay, so now we have TV shows too that we have to watch in order to understand the movies. So instead of it being its own thing, now, which again is part of Disney, I think, trying to capitalize on streaming, saying, hey, buy our service so you can, catch up with all your Marvel characters. Instead, what they're doing is alienating people. But because they're so bent on trying to just grow this and capitalize on this and make the most money from it and target as many people as they possibly can, they just keep doing more, 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 more. And you see quality slipping. You see, there's a whole thing with the CGI quality not being as good because they're trying to push so much out so fast that they're essentially completely overwhelming the studio that they physically can't work to the same standards that they would like to work to.
And I think this gets to our conversation about trying to be everything to everybody. You can't. You have to serve a fan base. And I think that a lot of the perception issues with Star Wars and maybe Marvel come from the fact that they do have to sort of find an audience that's big enough to sustain these things, but also be loyal enough to continue a cinematic universe. I'm kind of surprised that I'm mentioning Kevin Smith so much in these two episodes, but he's a prime example of a filmmaker who found his niche audience, and now he can do whatever he wants because what he makes is cheap. They know X amount of people are going to go see it, so it will all make money. So he has no problems making a movie. With Marvel, when you spend this much money, on every Marvel movie, when every movie has to make $1 billion, you're going to end up having perception issues because you've got to please everybody. If neckbeards on the internet typing from their mom's basements don't like Brie Larson, that's a huge percentage of the people who might go see a Marvel movie. And all of a sudden, because you need 100% of the audience, if 5% of these mom's basement guys don't like Brie Larson, then the Captain Marvel movie's not going to be successful. And they can almost get kidnapped from certain segments of the fandom, whether it be Star Wars, whether it be the theme parks, whether it be Marvel, when you have to have 100% at everything, when it has to be continual growth for the shareholders, then you need to have this movie made $1 billion. Well, this one's going to make $1.2 billion. And you can't just say, well, this movie isn't the $2 billion one. This is the $500 million one, because they don't like hearing that in the shareholder call.
Right. And that makes me think too that part of this with Marvel especially, and maybe a little bit with Star Wars too, part of these problems are a bit self-inflicted by Disney, because instead of saying, okay, we did something great, let's let it rest for a little bit, Disney went, okay, Marvel's a money printing machine and it has been for the last 10 years, so let's just keep going more and more and more and more, without thought to the fact that maybe people might not want to watch, 20 straight years of superhero movies. Maybe, interest will change. Maybe, interest would be better held if you waited and didn't put out quite as much and drew that anticipation up, for someone to go, oh my gosh, there's a new superhero movie coming out. That's so exciting. But instead they have this kind of, I don't want to say greed, but it's this desire to keep making money and please the shareholders, which is what a company has to do. So they latch on to what has been successful and they just run with it to the point of flooding people.
Bob Iger announcing Frozen 4 on the same day he announced Frozen 3. I think that's sort of the prime example of what they're doing, and where they're making these mistakes is they are trying to, whatever works, they're going to do it until it doesn't work anymore, which is always going to lead to these perception issues. Because if you take Star Wars, something that is beloved by so many people, even the people who don't love it to an extreme, but still have those nostalgia points attached to it and maybe really, really like it. And if you drive it into the ground and it's perceived that you destroyed it, it's almost like something that Maz and I were both fans of, this particular television show that has had a reboot and that has not gone very well. And it's like Frasier. Frasier was a character that started on Cheers in the early 80s, mid 80s, and went until the late 90s, early 2000s, but he went to the well one too many times. And there's only so much that you can get out of a particular piece of nostalgia if you're trying to appeal to a huge group of people. And they are still trying to appeal to a huge group of people. When they had Marvel be that successful, out of the blue, I don't think anybody expected what happened with Marvel. They should have just said, this was great. We caught lightning in a bottle, put it in a drawer for 5 years, and then decided if people were still wanting the new Ant-Man movie, instead of just continuing to make them until people don't want them anymore. You're seeing that with Disney's animation, where Disney is putting out some pretty doggone good movies. I just heard a person the other day listing their 10 favorite movies from 2023, and they had Elemental at third over Barbie and Oppenheimer. And it was a person who saw 200 movies or something last year. And Elemental is this great movie according to anybody who's seen it, but because of trying to do everything with streaming and trying to be in theaters and be in streaming immediately and selling hard copies if possible, they're trying to be everywhere and nobody saw that movie.
Yeah, it's an overabundance of things. And we're seeing the same thing with the live actions. When they first started them, it was cool. It was cool to see Maleficent from Maleficent's perspective. It was cool to see these different takes on, these movies that we'd gotten so used to over the years. And now they're doing live action Moana, which came out not even 10 years ago. And it's getting to the point of like, okay, well, why are you making something in the animated medium, which is, you choose that medium for a reason, supposedly. And now, not even 10 years later, you're turning around and saying, well, it could be live action too. What does it matter? It's like, well, maybe we don't need two Moana movies in the same decade. Maybe you could do, a sequel instead, or give us something else entirely that still has, captures that same kind of theme or that same kind of feeling and will then capture the same audience. But then you have a new idea in the works that you can sell more merch off of.
And it's not like they're not releasing new things. Like they had Wish and they had Elemental. And I do like that they're putting some of those movies that went straight to streaming and they're going to try to put them in the theater this year. That's a really cool idea. Whatever happened to going back and grabbing some of those old Disney movies and putting them in the theaters again? I would, even though I can see them on Disney Plus, we saw with Barbenheimer that people like to make these things events. They like to dress up and be around people who have similar interests to them. Disney could literally just start making these event days. Look at the Eras Tour movie with Taylor Swift. People made it an event. And that's what Disney's going to have to do, more than releasing just more in a cinematic universe. Find a way to capitalize off of what they did right with Barbie, what they did right with Oppenheimer, what they did right with the Eras Tour movie. These are things where you make it an event. People want to be on their Instagram. People want to share TikToks. This should be something that Disney excels at, but they really don't do it very well.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, they have so many movies that could be huge. I mean, just when you're saying that, I'm immediately thinking they could come back and do like, they could put Infinity War and Endgame back in the theater and make it like a two-show day, like how people were doing with Oppenheimer and Barbie. And you could have it be, like the Marvel Day. And people would go. People would go see that movie as like a two-part movie. Or you could put, I mean, my goodness, imagine if you put the Star Wars original trilogy back in theaters for a limited time. That would be huge.
With or without McClunky or whatever he says when he shoots at Han now. All of a sudden, George had to make that change, right?
Okay, if you went back to the original, that's printing money.
If you went back to the original, that would be absolutely printing money. You are correct. I think that it is amazing that we've watched, and we're people who like Disney. Obviously, we wouldn't talk about it this much if we didn't like it. Well, maybe that's not true. I see a lot of people talk about it a lot online who don't seem to like it. But even we can acknowledge that they're making some of these just incredible mistakes and they're doing things the wrong way. And if we like it this much, imagine how people who aren't as attached to it are going to be feeling. So I'm surprised we got 2 episodes talking about the bad PR at Disney right now. And it goes even beyond this stuff, just the perception of how long lines are in the theme parks. about how expensive a Disney vacation is. Some of these things, we're going to be talking with Sarah Says in a little bit about Make-A-Wish kids for the first time picked Universal over Disney by like a 3-1 margin on a recent call. And these are perception issues that are definitely causing issues with the company. And if we can be honest about it, I hope they're being honest about it.
Me too. I mean, especially when you talk about the theme parks, there's this hugely pervasive thought right now that the Disney parks are impossible to do because Genie is just too complicated. And I see it everywhere. I recently had a family member go to Disney for the very first time. And for months leading up to their trip with their family, they were so concerned about if they would be able to use Genie Plus because they kept hearing from people how impossible it was to manage. And, luckily their trip was great. They loved it. They had a great time. But, there's so many people now who will just go, I don't want to deal with that. I want my vacation to be relaxing. I don't want to deal with standing in line for, an hour and a half to ride one thing. And then I have to learn this whole new system on an app. And, the reality of it is it's not as complicated as people make it out to be. It really isn't. But when you have everyone telling you it's impossible, it's going to be a bit of a defeatist mindset that you kind of set yourself up with. And again, it's the perception.
Maz, this was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for being back on the show. And we are looking at a situation where we hit our 150th episode last month. We just passed 1,000 subscribers, and now looking forward to a brand new year. I'm super excited about all the topics that we don't even know we're going to be addressing this year and how much fun that's going to be to discuss. So thanks for being here, and I can't wait for 12 more months of overanalyzing theme parks.
It's going to be great.
We would love to hear from you and your opinions on these topics. If you're willing to keep things respectful, let's see those comments on the Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty YouTube channel. We have a big February planned. There will be conversations about Run Disney, Disney bounding at the parks, whether it's worth it to get a Walt Disney World annual pass, how Universal and Disney both handle their intellectual properties focused on children, and our good friend Kiki will be on the show for Black History Month to cover a number of topics, including some of the unique experiences she has had as a Black Disney cast member and a Black Disney influencer. February is going to be a really unique month for the podcast because leap year means there are 5 episodes of the show. This will all start with a brand new episode of Tall Guy Talks Travel with Rick Doherty next Thursday. Until then, have a great week.